increase in our charter school assessment. And so the result is a net decrease in state aid to Easton of almost $200,000 from last year, which further constrains our ability to maintain services, and it's not sustainable. Level funding with things like Chapter 90 that we talked about already is a challenge, because obviously the cost of things usually goes in one direction and it's up, so getting the same dollar amount year after year is effectively losing ground. But to have a net decrease is extraordinarily challenging. This is demonstrated as far as the state's total contribution to our budget. It's gone from about 18% in fiscal 17 down to 16% in fiscal 20. That itself is down from almost 23% before the recession.
The assessment for the charter school, is that based upon actual kids or just a percentage, or how do they work that?
Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, but at this point of the process, it is an estimate, and they refine it to what the actual, to be based on actuals for the children attending. Is that correct?
That's correct. And it is based on enrollment, but our charter assessment is definitely going to go up. Our assessment, what they budgeted for this fiscal year, is actually lower, and we're being charged more, and we're going to have to absorb that within the budget. So that number is probably more in line with what we're paying now. It's certainly higher than what our assessment's going to be this year, but it's probably closer to.
So we have that many kids in charter school?
I don't know the exact number that counts for. I don't know the exact amount that constitutes that assessment. We'll get it. But to Wendy's point, in the current fiscal year, we were assessed, I think, somewhere in the area of 75,000 for this, and now it has swung to 375.
So that's why I'm curious about it.
Yeah, so we'll dig down on that, and we'll definitely work with our delegation to look into it. But for now, the preliminary budget does have a significant challenge in that regard.
Thank you, Wendy.
And if that charter school assessment does go down, then the reimbursement that's currently budgeted, that will go down also, in our state revenue
Right.
the percentage
Will decrease.
will further.
It is worth noting, though, that the reimbursement you receive is significantly smaller than the assessment. So you get assessed a certain amount for charter schools, and you get a reimbursement for it, but reimbursement is not, I think it's, what, a quarter, maybe, if that, of the cost?
Yeah, and it's not even what the state is technically supposed to fund.
Yeah, it's,
Well, it used to be 100%, but I don't know if where it was 40%, was it something like that?
I do not know off the top of my head, but I do know that the reimbursement is significantly smaller than the assessment.
I think it was originally supposed to be 100% in the first year, and then for every successive year, it was going to be a lower percentage, but.
Oh, that microphone needs to be turned on.
Oh,
Oh, it's not on.
it's not on. There's a red button on the base.
Here or here?
On the base near the bottom. Tiny red button. Sorry, Wayne. Okay. So, reserve fund use. Since the onset of a recession and the stagnation of state aid of the town, which we just briefly reviewed, the town's been using reserve funds, which is free cash and stabilization funds, to close a revenue deficit at an unsustainable rate. 3 years ago, the board adopted a series of financial management guidelines intended to limit this practice. The most relevant portions are a goal of limiting your use of free cash to 50% of your certified free cash in an operating budget, and transferring 25% of that free cash to the stabilization fund. We were able to fully implement that last year. We've been transferring a quarter of our free cash into the stabilization fund on a regular basis, and have built the stabilization fund to its best point in a decade, which is good.
Say that again slower.
Sorry, I'm trying to be
I know you're trying to go fast,
sensitive to
but
time.
that's a really important
It's
point
very
that I
important,
just
yes.
want to underline.
Sure. So we have been adhering to those financial management guidelines, and we have built up our stabilization fund currently to the highest point that it's been in a decade. So that has not been without challenges in the budget, but it is a prudent thing to do, and everyone has been working together to do so. So that's a major accomplishment. That's important. Thank you, Dottie. This graph we show every budget year. I think that it's very helpful to illustrate exactly what a structural revenue deficit looks like. So this is a stacked graph showing in blue any stabilization fund use in a given year, in red any free cash use, and in years where you did both, it stacks. So this looks back 13 years now to the last time there was an override in Easton. That was the last year that there was no use of reserves. Nearly immediately after that override, as everyone is aware, there was the worst recession in many years, which wiped out a significant amount of projected growth. You saw new growth fall from 1 million a year to, I think, 300,000. And you see the cuts to state aid beginning in fiscal 9, and that's when the town's use of reserve funding began to expand and exceed to over $1 million per year. And that's been the case for over a decade. The town has used between $1 and $2 million of reserve funds each year to balance the budget. I don't know why that just happened. To close the structural revenue deficit. Well, the board adopted a series of guidelines to limit the practice of this, and you see that after a peak of using just over $2 million in reserve funds to balance the budget in fiscal 16, the use has been coming down. In the current fiscal year, 19, we used $1.2 million in reserve funds, 0 stabilization funds, both lows for many years, and what we are currently projecting in fiscal 20 is using just over $1 million, which is half our available free cash. This is in accordance with the financial management guidelines, but it's a significant reduction in revenue available for appropriation, and it would represent the fewest reserve dollars used in a budget in well over a decade. Again, that's an important goal. It's a goal we're striving towards, but to cut our reserve use by half, effectively. If you look in 16, we're using over $2 million, and in 4 years to cut $1 million out of the budget, which is what you're doing, that significantly constrains your ability to fund your services. So for now, that is the plan. That is what is proposed in the budget, but we do have a deficit that we need to continue to work on. On the expense side, the town has been successful in reducing expenses in some key areas. We have saved some money in health insurance and actualized pretty low rates of premium increases, so far averaging only 1% a year in the GIC. We have been leaders in energy reduction. We're one of the first green communities in Bristol County. We receive significant grant funding every year to make sure our buildings are as efficient as they can be. We have renegotiated, both in prior contracts and recent ones, wage growth patterns. So unions have moved from 40% of growth in a decade to 30% over 15 years, as well as most recently having many of our labor groups agree to relatively conservative wage packages for fiscal 19, 20, and 21. 4 of them agreeing to 0 base wage increases in light of the town's ongoing revenue deficit. So we've been working really hard to try to keep those expense budgets as lean as humanly possible. I'll talk more about that in the community comparison report another night. Despite those successes, challenges do persist because of the revenue challenges we face, and because we continue to have expenditures largely driven by fixed costs rise at rates that outpace those limited revenue growth. Town department increases at this time are largely contractual. They're basically reflective of collective bargaining agreements on the books and are projected to increase by $560,000, which is 3.3%, which is going to bring it all town departments, DPW, police, fire, town government, library assessment to $17.5 million in fiscal 20. The Easton school budget, currently we have a placeholder in there. We put a placeholder of 4%. That is not a number from the Easton Public Schools. They have their own concurrent budget process, which happens in a separate lane, but working together with us through the winter and spring. And we will be refining that number with some actuals once they come forward with their first assessment for fiscal 20. I think it's important to note, and I'll borrow terminology from the schools, that there is something to be said for living within your means and producing balanced budgets within your available revenues. We have to do it, but we always present revenue first for a reason. Our budgets are largely reactive to the revenue that we have available. These budgets are not the production of a balanced budget at the end of this process, which we will do. We have to. We will produce a balanced budget by May. Simply putting a balanced budget forward does not equate to being proactive or strategic and addressing what the needs of your organization, your community are. I think that's important. It's something that we're going to dig into more through the spring, understanding that just because something is not necessarily included in a departmental budget request doesn't mean that there is no merit or that it's a need that doesn't exist. So I've asked the departments, the larger ones, to submit side letters quantifying and qualifying what are the needs. For instance, we all know, we're very familiar with the police department. The chief has been trying to add 3 officers for, I think, 4 years. He received 2 in fiscal 18 with significant debate. And we have been sharing a school resource officer in the interim because we have not had funding available for that 3rd officer. That is in his department's preliminary request. I do not know if it will stay. We need to eliminate a $1.9 million deficit. There are needs in public works for building maintenance that are not even requested through the budget because we're attempting to keep those budget numbers low. Nonetheless, I felt it was important that when we're all together with the finance committee, that we have a conversation about what are those needs that we know exist and are not funding because we just don't have the choice right now.
Well, I think in addition to using the terminology of proactive, reactive, and strategic, I think we have to add the word risk. And it's really important that we look at this, when we're looking at the numbers that our department heads are bringing in, we have to realize that there's risk to not doing some of that also. So just throw that out there.
Absolutely.
And the last little point there is, so again, schools are a placeholder, towns are contractual largely at this point. Funds available for appropriation are largely limited due to increases in fixed costs. So this is a selection of fixed costs. Fixed costs is basically certain obligations the town must and will pay in each given year to just run our business. Those are things like debt service, employee health insurance, workers' comp and property liability insurance, any sorts of snow and ice deficits generated by overspending a snow and ice account, the employer assessment to our retirement system. And we also treat the Southeastern Regional School as a bit of a fixed cost because, again, all of these have it in common. They're difficult to contain, and we have little to no immediate control on what they are in a year-over-year sense. So just going through each of these, debt service is projecting an increase of $466,000. That increase is primarily due to the full impact of the ESCO debt associated with the energy services contract project basically being moved from the school operating budget to the debt budget because it is a debt payment, so that is an appropriate place for it to be, as well as some premium paydowns on short-term interim financing for capacity purchases for sewer projects, which we touched on earlier tonight. Fiscal 20 is kind of a hurdle year. The total debt service is still within a reasonable and healthy amount for the town's total spending of about 5 to 7%. Fiscal 20, it's not shown here, but the projected debt service in fiscal 20 is actually lower than it was in fiscal 18. There was just quite a bit of drop between 18 and 19. Nonetheless, it's a significant increase that we'll have to bear. The good news is that due to maturing debt, about $250,000 of that will come off the books next year. So there's some pay downs in fiscal 20, and then that number comes down by $250,000. Employee insurance is preliminary, this projection. We're projecting right now a 5% increase. As I mentioned before, what we've been fortunate to see through GIC is actual rate increases. When you average the savings moving in the first year, closer to about 1% a year. Last year, I think our actual rate increases were just over 1%. We have been informed from the GIC that the preliminary aggregate rate increase will be 3.3%, but we're going to wait until we get the plan specific because there's multiple plans within the GIC offerings. We'll get those plan-specific premium rates for fiscal 20 at the end of February. We'll plug that in with our actual enrollments for employees and retirees, and we'll update that number. We expect it to come down, hopefully. Workers' comp and property and liability insurance. Those are related to a couple of things. One, workers' comp is audited each year based on payroll and is adjusted based on those payroll assumptions. That number is still subject to change. Property and liability insurance premiums have increased as a result of a routine reassessment of the value of our buildings by our insurer. But these numbers are preliminary. Again, we hope to see that come down slightly. Snow and ice deficit, we're projecting a deficit of $200,000 for fiscal year 20. I'm almost scared to say it, but our spending in this area is relatively low for this time of year. We are not tracking today to have a snow and ice deficit of $200,000. However, there's plenty of winter left. We've all been in February and felt like we were doing pretty good before and then gotten crushed for a couple of months. So hopefully things continue the way that they are. And if we can, if the storm Tuesday isn't too severe and if winter continues to be mild, we would obviously reduce or eliminate that projected deficit. That, again, is in there to be conservative at this early point in the process.
Is the deficit 200 or 100?
Sorry, let me. The budget for fiscal 19, there was a $100,000 snow and ice deficit in fiscal 19.
That was the carryover. That was the carryover from fiscal 18
For
that we had to
debts.
raise in fiscal 19.
The actual snow and ice budget itself is $488,000. A few years ago, that was only $188,000. That was kind of a policy decision because snow and ice is one of the only accounts, I think, if not the only account, we're allowed to overspend or deficit spend.
Correct.
So you usually don't want to over budget and commit funds that otherwise could be used elsewhere. As you can see, we're very constrained. Every dollar counts. However, after a few bad winters, we purposefully added $100,000 per year to that snow and ice budget to get it up to $488,000, which is where it has been for a couple of years, I believe. So again, assuming things are okay through the rest of the season, we may have a zero there, but that's large. It's entirely based on the weather. Pension assessment, again, we're looking at an 8% increase. That's significant, but it's in keeping with what we've seen. We're part of a county retirement assessment. Employee wages contribute to that, but they also have an obligation to fully fund. They're on track to do that, I believe, in 2028. And as we get closer to that full funding date, they will continue to be assessing similar assessments. Regional school, we plugged in a 15% increase there because I believe that's what the increase has been for the past 2 years. That is a substantial increase. That is not a number from the regional school. Much like the Easton Public Schools, they have their own concurrent budget process that they develop and will provide to us, and they'll be reviewed by the Selectmen and the Finance Committee during budget hearings like any other department. And again, that will be revised as we move through this budget process. So the preliminary budget summary, again, you have 2 slides here. The town operating budgets are summarized below for a total projected expenditure of a sum of $87,234,000. Projecting our total preliminary revenue of a sum is $85,333,000. This yields a projected preliminary deficit of $1.9 million. It's a significant amount. However, the town always has a preliminary projected deficit at this point of the budget process. We have had preliminary deficits of this size before, and we have overcome those before and will in this case as well. The things we're going to be doing, we're going to monitor state aid. Those are projections based on the governor's fiscal 20 budget. We'll continue working with our delegation, advocating for adequate support to Easton. Obviously, the state has a significant budgetary challenge themselves each and every year. Our legislative delegation does advocate for Easton. They do bring funding to Easton in many different forms, including recently $125,000 for sewer infrastructure. But we will continue to advocate for increased Chapter 70 unrestricted aid and anything that they can do to help. We're going to continue to refine our local receipts as our actual collections continue through the year. Again, that's standard. We will do that. As I mentioned before, the projected 2020 budget adheres to those reserve use guidelines. It's the right thing to do. It's where we want to be. However, we are looking at a situation where we have a significant deficit and we're deliberately reducing our own revenue by $1 million in 4 years. So we may need to look at that. Expenditures, final numbers for health insurance are not in yet. That'll have a significant impact on the budget. Health insurance is a sizable portion of the budget. Departmental budget requests are going to be refined. There's very little room for cutting without reducing services, but we will be looking very closely at refining those numbers as well as those fixed costs that I just talked through. So I apologize if I try to rush through that. Nonetheless, I look forward to working with you, Finance Committee, School Committee, and the community to produce another balanced budget by May.
Great, thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Connor.
Tonight.
All right. Any other notes from your office?
Not that I can think of at this hour.
Right. Well, if you're watching at home still, thank you very much. It was a long meeting tonight, and thanks to my fellow board members and staff for staying this late. One thing I did want to give a shout out to is the Lions Club auction is coming up on March 3rd. Their online auction starts February 17th, and keep your eyes out for information from them. And at that point, we'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?